Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Foster Hirsch. Foster is a graduate of Stanford and Columbia, and today is professor in the film department at Brooklyn College, where he's been since 1973. He's the author of numerous books on the history of film and Hollywood, and joins me today to talk about his latest book called Hollywood and the Movies of the 50s, The Collapse of the Studio System, The Thrill of Cinema, and the Invasion of the Ultimate Body Snatcher.
The Thrill of Cinerama.
Foster.
Tyrell, the Thrill
Cinerama.
of Cinerama.
I apologize.
Yes,
The
that's
Thrill of
interesting
Cinerama.
because that's long before your time. That was a widescreen
Yeah.
process introduced in 1952.
Well,
no longer available.
In 50 shows, I once called someone by the wrong name, but that was the first time I messed up the title of their book. I'm sorry, Foster.
But that's instructive because Cinerama is not a term in current use at all. And in fact, Cinerama cannot be produced anywhere in the world, at least in its original version. So it's a thing of the past.
Well, it was something that I was introduced to at the start of your book. You talk about your experience going to the movies in the 1950s, and this was 1952, I believe, and this is Cinerama. Could you recreate what that experience was like?
Yes, it was,
and what that
so
was?
memorable, what it was, and the experience itself, which was so memorable, because in the early 50s, because of the threat of television, the attendance at movies had dropped precipitously, and studio heads of state realized that if their industry was going to survive, they had to offer filmgoers the kind of entertainment that they couldn't get at home for free on their new television sets. And so what they did is they specialized in new content and new technologies, 3D, and various widescreen options. The first of them was Cinerama, which was a huge curvilinear process that took in your peripheral vision. I remember being in the theater and being surrounded by this huge image. It was projected on 3 separate screens. It required 16 projectionists to have a correct screening of Cinerama. It was very demanding. And by 1962, that 3-screen process was retired to what was called one-strip Cinerama, but it wasn't the same. It was easier, it was technologically more friendly, but it didn't have the magnitude of the original 3-strip Cinerama, which cannot be shown, I believe I'm correct, any place in the world anymore. The technology doesn't exist. So I'm talking about something that was a phenomenon of its day.
Mhm.
They were travelogue films. They weren't narrative films because the screen was presumed to be too large to tell a story. At the end of the 3-strip period, there were some films, including the original How the West Was Won. It was a narrative film. But the original Cinerama films in the 50s were luxurious travelogues. People in the 50s didn't travel the way they do now. And so it was a way actually of seeing Europe and the Far East and exotic places on this huge screen. I loved the process. I loved the films, but they are a thing of the past.
When you were watching, when you were going to the cinema in the 1950s, did you have a sense at that time that the studio system was undergoing radical changes and evolving into something else?
No,
A new
no,
Hollywood.
I can't pretend I knew that. I was in the 50s, which was my decade of growing up and going to the movies. I was an avid cinema goer from a very early age. I think I was lucky to have 2 parents who loved movies and who took their kid to the movies. And what was especially interesting is they didn't like the same kind of movie. So my father took me to see Westerns and war films, which were his favorites. My mother couldn't stand them. And she took me to see melodramas, often with Bette Davis. My father refused to see any movie with Bette Davis. So I would go with my mother to the melodramas and the musicals, and with my father to Westerns and to war films primarily. Both parents disliked comedy. And I grew up not seeing many comedies, and I'm not a fan of comedies to this day. Isn't that terrible? I've been teaching for years. I've hardly ever taught a comic film in class. And the 50s were not a good period
That's
for comedy
interesting.
filmmaking. 50s were not a good time for comedies. Great time for epics, film noir, thrillers, and melodramas, not comedies.
Yeah, you mentioned more towards the end of the book, Saul Bellows' critique of I think it was the dull solemnity of this period in of movies in the 50s. I, I can remember a few years ago watching a movie called Some Like It Hot and finding it absolutely hilarious.
That is the best comedy of the period. And some have even
Is
said
it?
it's the
Okay.
greatest of all American comedies. No, you're in very popular company that is a beloved film classic. But I would say that's the only comedy of the 50s that has entered the canon. It's not, that is really part of the pantheon. It's a beloved film, but it was a rarity in the 50s. There were very few really outstanding comedies for a reason that I think I tried to make in my book, which was to counter Saul Bellows' statement that the 50s were a period of dull solemnity. That's the stereotype, that it was a dull, well-mannered, conformity-ridden, uh, um, a period of good manners and no depth, of anodyne television comedies about happy families like The Nelsons and Father Knows Best. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The period was much more complex and much more riven with anxiety and debate. It was among the most polarized of all decades in terms of politics, the kinds of politics that we're seeing in America now. I don't know if you're aware, being living in Japan, how polarized and polarizing American politics of the moment are. But to find that degree of disagreement and heated rhetoric and political chaos, you have to go back to the 50s and the period of the Blacklist and the fear of the Red Menace and communist infiltration. It was a very loaded period politically, and I think a very good soil for the kinds of movies that the period excelled in: drama, melodrama, thrillers, crime films. It was not at all the way it's depicted. Part of the reason I wanted to write my book was to disabuse of viewers of notions, of very superficial notions of what the 50s were like. I feel very, let's put it this way, I feel it's my decade, so I'm a little possessive, and I want to protect my decade from its bad press, and I think unfair press. The 60s gets all the credit for being progressive in a period of great social revolution, and it's true, extraordinary things happened in the 60s. But those the events of the 60s were preceded by the events of the 50s. The 60s happened because of the 50s, and there's a kind of through line between the two decades, much closer in spirit than they're often given credit for. And indeed, my next book is Hollywood and the Movies of the 60s. So it's a continuation of the themes I explore in the 50s book.
Well, because of that through line that exists, I would say now there's no one more qualified to write about the 60s than you after
Well,
this
what I
great
have
work
in my
on the
favor,
50s.
Terrell, what I have in my favor, I was there. Younger historians, and there will be younger historians, of course, who will write about the 50s and the 60s, as they should, with new perspectives and new points of view. But the younger people weren't there. I lived through the period. I'm a senior citizen now, so I'm one of the last of my generation still able to remember what it was like. I know how those films were received at the time. I know the reputations they had. I know the culture of the time. So I can look at those films with a double perspective, from the point of view of a film goer circa 1955, and from the historian's point of view of 2025, looking back all those years. The younger historians don't have that same double perspective that I have, which I think is important. And as a historian, I think it's my responsibility to look at the period in which I grew up. One of the critics of my book, the best review I got was in the New York Review of Books, and the critic said, Glenn O'Brien, who's a wonderful writer, that my book, as much as anything, is a memoir. It's a memoir of
Yeah.
going to the
Yeah,
movies
I
at that.
loved the personal touches. Yeah. I'm reading a another memoir at the moment, written by a historian, and she in writing this book, she took a break from what she normally does and wrote a memoir of her family life after some uh, memories that are 60 years old. But what she found was that her memories and whatever historical documents remain didn't always match. Did you come into any moments like that in writing this where your memories and the historical documents were off by a little bit? And how did you reconcile the differences if
It,
there were?
no, I didn't. Um, I didn't. My memory as to the reception of the time and the film's placement historically of the time was really pretty accurate. And and the viewpoint from now didn't require a lot of change. I was worried in revisiting some films that I'd seen and liked or didn't like as a kid growing up. How different would my response be now? And in almost every case, films I liked and admired then, I still did. And films that I was iffy about or reserved about, I still had the same opinion. So I didn't have to do a lot of historical revisionism of the kind you're talking about. I can see how that might well happen, but it didn't happen with me. Maybe I'm just stubborn or I don't change my mind.
It's,
But my opinions then pretty much are my opinions now.
I think because you followed this interest, you had a precocious talent for analyzing good quality cinema, I would say.
I did.
If
I did. I was very good at it, and I knew as a kid that I wanted to do exactly what I've done, which is to write about movies, to talk about movies, to teach, or to be a moderator or a host or an interviewer. And people said, "Well, didn't you want to write film scripts?" No. Didn't you want to direct a movie? No. Didn't you want to go into the business? No. I always wanted to do what I've done. I did have a talent for it, and it was clear from a very early age. I sort of found my path, and I'm stubborn. I stuck with it. I'm still doing it.
Right. So we started talking a little earlier about the cultural mood and what was going on in the 1950s. I'd like to go over a few more of those things, starting with something called the Paramount Decree. I think I've got that right, and its effect on film production and also the exhibition of films in cinemas.
Yes, the Paramount Decree, sometimes called the Consent Decree, was a decision by the Supreme Court that the structure of the film industry in the 30s and the 40s was in restraint of trade because the film studios, A, produced their films, B, distributed their films, and C, exhibited their films in their own chain of theaters. And that's why we still have some theaters left called United Artists or Fox or Paramount, the Lowe's Theater owned by MGM. So there was no, with that through line, there was no way for an independent producer to be considered for the best theaters in those days. The best theaters were the downtown big movie palaces, very different kind of exhibition than today. It was a closed system. But when the court determined that the studios had to sell off their theater chains, it was the beginning of the end for the structure of the studio system. So in the 50s and 60s, the studio system gradually, painfully, but inevitably came to an end. And there was a chance then for independents to have a way into presenting their films in the best theaters. The big studios, the big five, did not have a lock on the best theaters because the studios
Could
recognized
you
this
introduce
was a death
what's?
blow.
Oh, sorry.
because the theaters, the studios recognized that the consent decree was in effect a death throw, that it would spell the end of the system. They took a very long time to sell off their theaters. It took quite a while. It took almost until the end of the 60s for it to be completely finished.
Which studios were big in the 1950s and
The
or
Big
were
Five.
doing well at that time, and why did others that, like say RKO, it had trouble surviving?
The Big Five, which your viewers may not be. Are you familiar with that term, the Big Five? It's the five major studios that produced almost all the films in
Not before
Hollywood.
reading your book, no.
Okay, RKO, MGM, Warner Brothers, Fox, and Paramount. And then there were the major minors, Columbia and Universal. They did not have their own chain of theaters. The most successful studio in the 50s and the studio that saved the industry was 20th Century Fox, because Darryl Zanuck, who was the head of state at Fox, realized that in order for his business to survive, something new would have to be introduced, and he and his partners not devised, but bought CinemaScope. And they had a monopoly on CinemaScope, which is a huge widescreen process, not as wide as Cinerama, which was sort of unmanageable, but extremely wide. And the first film they presented in the new process was called The Robe. And that film, without exaggerating, saved the industry. It was a biblical epic. You couldn't do a biblical epic now and hope that a topic like that would save the industry. But in 1953, a more religious time in this country, it did. It was a huge hit. Fox then said, "We're married to CinemaScope. Every film that we're releasing will be in the new widescreen process." And they sold CinemaScope to the other majors. And the others used CinemaScope sporadically for special projects. RKO did not survive because of a man named Howard Hughes, the billionaire of aeronautics. In my book, I'm not very tactful, and I don't know how to get around saying the fact that Howard Hughes was crazy and entered a studio which had always been troubled, but somehow managed to survive. And he succeeded in ending it. So RKO died in 1956, 1957. And that was a very uncomfortable time. A major studio giving up the ghost, and then a second studio, a minor studio named Republic, also folded up its tents by the end of the 50s. But that was due to extreme mismanagement on the part of Hughes. I say he's crazy, but he wasn't a fool. He sold RKO. He made money. Nobody else did. He impoverished the studio, but he walked away with some profit. So he was shrewd, of course, but he was not suited to be a mogul. The way Jack Warner, Harry Cohn, Darryl Zanuck, Louis B. Mayer, they were geniuses at their job. They were great pioneer filmmakers. Howard Hughes had a different point of view. He was a businessman. He was shrewd, but he didn't know how to run a studio.
There was some of the major changes that were going on in the 1950s. One of them was this suburbanization of cities, and another was that over the course of this decade, most homes were getting televisions. So, taking those in turns, or however you like, how did these two major events in American history change the way people attended the cinema?
They both had a huge impact. People I remember the day that television arrived in our home. I remember the day and the first moment when I saw television. And it was people of your generation can't know the impact that had. Here was this new piece of furniture in your living room, and on that, and it was a small screen, you had the world enter your house. You had variety shows and stars and comedies and interview shows and news shows. It changed the dynamic of how we lived on a day-to-day basis. It was an extraordinary invention. And at the beginning of the decade, relatively few television sets. By the end of the decade, I don't know the exact statistics, but almost all American homes had one. And people were beginning to move from the city to the suburbs. And that meant that the patronage for the big downtown movie palaces began to slide, and those theaters, great theaters, began to close one by one in the 60s and the 70s. And that moved to suburbia, at first neighborhood theaters, but then not in the 50s, but later on in the 70s, the beginning of the multiplex. And going to see a movie at a single screen theater is very different from going to see a movie at a multiplex. My students don't understand what a single screen theater is, but you went to see a movie at that theater. And it was a theater that had some real architectural distinction, even in neighborhood theaters. They had a sense of style. Nowadays, you go to shooting galleries with bland curtains, and they're what, 10, 15 screens? It's like the supermarket. It doesn't have the exclusivity or the prestige or the atmosphere or the sense of occasion that going to the movies did. Not only were the movies better in the 50s, I say proudly, going to the movies was better. It was a different experience. We have one in Manhattan. We have one single screen movie house left. The Paris Theater, saved only because Netflix took it over. Every other theater is a multiplex. And theaters are closing. I don't know how it is in Japan. But this is a topic for a contemporary historian. What's going to happen to the theater going experience itself in the age of streaming? Are there theaters
Yeah.
in your country? I mean, do people go regularly to physical theaters to see movies?
They do. I don't know how well the attendance is here, but I know in all the downtowns of the cities here there are, and even in the small cities they have cinemas that people go to. In downtown Sapporo, I can think of three different cinemas that are available
Multiplexes.
for people to attend. But yes,
Yeah,
multiplexes. Yeah,
multiplexes.
yeah.
No single screen houses left.
No, your conversation about the single screen house made me think of our family cabin when I was growing up was at this little pond in Saskatchewan called Clearwater Lake. And uh, a few kilometers away, there's a drive-in theater there that I used to go to in my childhood. We'd make popcorn and then drive there and attend a movie at this outdoor drive-in theater, and it's one of the only ones I think in Canada still in operation at this little place almost in the middle of nowhere in Saskatchewan, but it's still going every
It's
summer.
still in operation, and have they added
Yeah,
screens, or is it it's still a single screener?
still a single screen. Yeah,
Sing, single screen,
yeah.
because
So
the
it's
drive-in
it.
circuit has added screens. There aren't many drive-ins left, but sometimes I get a sickening feeling when I drive by a drive-in, and it's not one screen, it's like six or seven or eight, and that destroys
Oh,
the
wow.
whole sphere. Yes, it'd be confusing. Where do you
Yeah,
look?
yeah. Guess so.
But the drive-in
There's one of the
experience in America is virtually over. Virtually over. There are very few left.
There's another aspect of the history that I wanted to ask you about that I don't know a lot of or I didn't know a lot of the details until reading your book. I knew a little from the study of Ronald Reagan's background, but that's the Hollywood Blacklist and how that affected what stories Hollywood was willing to tell, or maybe which ones they were afraid to
Could
tell.
tell or
Could you,
could tell.
or couldn't
Yes.
tell? Yeah.
Could and could not tell, exactly. The blacklist had a profound impact on the industry. And I have a very long section in my book on the history of the blacklist and the history of the Hollywood 10, a group of filmmakers, screenwriters accused of being communists who were brought before congressional committee, a congressional committee, the House on Un-American Activities Committee, to ask about their politics. And it was a very controversial committee, and many people now feel that the un-Americans in this activity were the members of the committee itself, who were asking people, are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? And the Hollywood 10 refused to answer. It turned out that, yes, each of them was guilty as accused. Each was or had been a communist. But the question is, does that mean they should not have been employed by Hollywood? Should they have lost their jobs because of their political convictions? Yes, if they were guilty of conspiring against the government or involved in an attempt to overthrow the government. Yes, but none of them was so charged or guilty in that way. And most of them had been communists in the 30s, and then watching what happened in Russia, realizing communism doesn't work. Look what happened in Cuba and Russia. They no longer were members of the party, but they didn't want to cooperate with the committee by answering questions they felt the committee had no right to ask. And even worse, the worst part of this very unhappy period was when the committee not only asked you about your political background, but if you were willing to admit that you had been a communist, you also, to purge yourself, had to name the names of those who had been at meetings with you. That was a terrible question to ask anybody. And many refused to answer that question. Some who became known as friendly witnesses, Elia Kazan, the most famous of all friendly witnesses, were able to sustain their careers, but were forever after vilified because they became known as informers and other names less flattering for what they did. So it was a time of great political divisiveness and also political invasiveness. To be a member of the Communist Party at that period technically was not illegal. And yet, because of the fear of communism and the fear of communist infiltration and takeover, as wonderfully dramatized in that movie, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, there was a fear. I remember growing up, we were indoctrinated in school about communism and Russia, our mortal enemy. They were going to invade. We had to be careful because they were going to enter our homes and change us. Their ideology was so radically different from ours that we would be transformed. In the language of that great film, we would become pod people. Conformists who had no minds of our own, but just followed the political leaders and did what we were told. So that fear of the Red Menace led to the creation of this House on Un-American Activities Committee that asked questions that many to this day would say they had no right to ask. But that destroyed many lives. Many people had to relocate to Europe in order to continue a career. And many filmmakers had to watch what they said in their movies. Or if they wanted to make a political statement, they had to make it indirectly, obliquely, or metaphorically. They couldn't be direct about it because they were afraid of political exposure or condemnation themselves. But there were creative subterfuges. And if you read a lot of the interesting political allegories of the 50s, and there are many, you can see that beneath the surface, there is a political questioning of the entire Red Menace and Blacklist process. It's there in the films, subtextually. They couldn't say it directly, but sometimes if you have to be indirect, that could lead to a kind of creative inspiration. I would ask your readers, your listeners, to look at High Noon, On the Waterfront, Them, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Day the Earth Stood Still. It was often in science fiction films where there's this loaded political context, metaphors about the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Not directly, indirectly.
It's one of the aspects of reading the book that I enjoyed most was connecting it with that time and the culture. And I think you're right to point out that the fear that was present in that time of communism and of nuclear war. One of the things I enjoyed was how the impact of the use of the atomic bomb on the genre of science fiction that was coming out in the late 40s and throughout the 50s. Would you mind sharing a few anecdotes from or how it had an impact?
The fear of the bomb and the power that scientific research had unleashed actually gave birth to the genre of science fiction. What I discovered, I kind of knew it, but what I discovered was before 1950, there were virtually no science fiction films in American movie making. Science fiction as a popular movie genre was born in the 1950s as a response to the fear of nuclear power and nuclear annihilation. So all the great science fiction films of the 50s, Them is about giant ants. And the giant ants came into being because of nuclear waste and nuclear experimentation. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was caused by knowledge of the bomb and nuclear exploration. So scientific advancement came along with the fear of what knowing too much could produce. If you know too much, you had the ability to destroy the world. A perfect formula, a perfect background for creating science fiction films. And I would say the 5 or 6 masterpieces of science fiction in the 50s are among the best ever made in the genre. The Incredible Shrinking Man. How does he shrink to an infinitesimal size? Because he's been exposed to atomic radiation. So atomic radiation, atomic experiment, gave birth to a very creative series of science fiction movies of the 50s. As good as I would say even better than most of the big budget mega special effects movies of the current moment. They were very light on special effects. They were black and white, low budget movies, but they had enormous imagination. And they were a response to the fear of the bomb.
One movie reference that I got from your book that I really enjoyed was Peyton Place. I'd never heard of the novel or the movie, but I watched it and really enjoyed it, and also thought there are a lot of themes in this movie that seem a little, I don't know what to say, a risk for 1950s culture. Would it be fair to say?
Yes. It'd be very fair to say. 50s culture, as we discussed earlier, was condemned as almost automatically condemned these days as being so polite and so buttoned up. But that politeness led to something that was just its opposite, a counter movement, which was to take away the mask and take away the veneer of politeness. And Peyton Place, and that is a sanitized adaptation of a very steamy novel. It was, I think, the bestseller of the whole decade. We passed around copies at school in brown paper, and the sexy passages were underlined. So we were very conscious that we were being exposed to forbidden material. Peyton Place was this forbidden text We kids, our parents are reading this book and they don't want us to, but here's a copy and go to the underlying passages. I remember in school being reading some of the seedy passages of the book. The book is about every kind of sexual perversion or misdemeanor you possibly want to know about and has ever been discussed, all there in a novel from the mid 50s. The film suggests a lot of it, but it sanitizes it. It's a very well mannered film about some very ill mannered subject matter. But it was an enormous success as a novel
Yes.
and as a film. But I'm not surprised that your generation, representing your generation, you've never heard the title, Peyton Place. It didn't mean anything to you? Didn't know it.
No, I was surprised to learn that it was a novel, a movie, and a long-running series as well.
Yes, after the film, it was a
But
long-running
I thoroughly
television
enjoyed
series.
it.
The film is very well made, but it's daring for 1957, but it's very measured in comparison to the steaminess of the novel, which is not bad at all. It's pretty well written for what it is. It was an enormous popular success, and it was sort of the underside of the 50s. Here's this immaculate New England community supposed to be perfectly mannered. Ah, but let's look beneath the surface and we'll find something else. You could almost take that as a metaphor for the 1950s themselves. Yes, well mannered and well behaved. We were more polite then. But that doesn't mean there wasn't an inner life going on beneath the veneer of gentility and civility.
The setting, in terms of what time this uh, movie and book take place, is during the Second World War in 1941. But as you said a
Yes.
minute ago, the movie came out in 1957. How did the culture of the 50s subtly make its way into the setting of the 1940s?
The novel is set, as you say, in the 40s, but everybody took it. And the film doesn't really try to dissuade you, took it as an emblem of the current moment. I don't know that I don't know that I can answer the question, except that's every decade is always making and seeing films and movies and TV shows and novels and plays about itself, even when not set contemporaneously. So it wasn't set in the 40s, but everybody took it as a story about the manners and mores of the 50s.
I'm curious to know, when you're working with students of the youngest generation or mine, which is just a little bit older than them, how do they respond to the movies of the 50s? What movies do they connect with? I imagine James Dean they can connect with, but maybe a movie like the one we were just talking about, the youngest generation might look at Peyton Place and say, well, there are no black people or African American people in this film, or they might make
And they
critiques like
certainly would
this.
say that. Yes, they certainly would say that, and that's a very valid point. Um, my track record so far has been very good when I show students films from the past. I seem to be able to make a convincing case for the validity of those films. I'm careful as to what I show. Students always like James Dean. You're right to choose that name. Every generation of students that I have taught, every one of them, they still respond to him. And we can show Rebel Without a Cause, and they say, well, that's not like a high school today, and there are no people of color in this high school. But there seems to be something essentially truthful about that movie anyway. And I think they're responding to James Dean's power as an actor. He was a great actor, a great instinctive actor. Students respond to Marlon Brando. They do not respond to Katharine Hepburn. She is by far the least popular figure from the classic era. Uh, they they don't like her voice. They don't like her manner of speaking. They don't like what they perceive as her hauteur. Um, they don't like her. She's number one Miss Unpopular. But if I choose my topics carefully and my films carefully, I have a pretty good track record. But just this last semester, I had the first student in nearly 60 years in the classroom I really didn't like. And that troubled me. And it was a question of temperament, and the student was unwilling to put herself into another time period. She was a radical left ideologue, and everything had to be according to the orthodoxies of the moment. And she resisted almost, and I think a lot of it was she had trouble with men. She had trouble with a white male teacher. I thought, oh, do I want to quit teaching after all these years? And I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to give in to that one very unlikable student. But there's a problem. But there's a danger of generational divide. I'm so much older than the students now. And as the 50s recede into further and further into the past, and I don't just teach about the 50s, we talk about the 40s and the 30s and silent movies too, but we're talking about movies made a long time ago. I do not show contemporary films. Other teachers do. I don't. I show films from the past. Most of the time, I can make a case for the validity of the film. And students have been very generous and patient. I had trouble with this one student, though I was professional and polite every moment. She would not have known how I felt. I was polite, but I sensed that she may not be alone. I may face that kind of political rigidity and orthodoxy going forward, and that's a problem to me. I feel bad about that. I hope I'm wrong,
Yeah.
but there's a divide. I felt we often just weren't speaking the same language. She liked a contemporary movie that I found utterly repellent. I don't know if a film called Honora has played in Japan. It won unaccountably and horrifyingly the Academy Award this year. It's a repellent film on every level. But some of my students liked it.
Yeah, it's when doing history and trying to connect with the America of the past. It's important as historians that we say we need to do our best to understand them in their time. What
In their
decisions were
time.
in front of them, and how were they seeing the world, right? And I think with younger generations, especially in social sciences and humanities, have grown up with a lot more of a social justice philosophy in their education, which has them at times looking back at the past and giving it a moral critique based on how their vision of morality is, or idea of morality has
Based,
evolved to the current day.
no, but based on thinking of the current moment without any attempt to
Yes.
evaluate the past as it was. I try as a historian to talk about the past as it happened and not as maybe the current generation could have wished it to have happened, but as it happened. I have a younger colleague who was teaching American films, and he chose for the period of the 50s a film by Ida Lupino. I like Ida Lupino a lot. I think she's wonderful. But to choose the American 1950s as represented by a film of Ida Lupino is to misrepresent the historical period. He chose her because she was the only female director of the time. She was very talented. I talk about her a lot in my
Mm.
book, but I can't say you're teaching history correctly or representing Hollywood in the 50s correctly if you focus on Ida Lupino and ignore, alas, if you want, the white men who made the great movies of the period. Do you follow what I'm
Mm.
saying?
And
It's
something
a mis it's a
Absolutely, yeah.
misrepresentation.
And I'll add one other thing too, and you sort of touched on it earlier with I forget how exactly you called it, a biblical epic, or you were talking about the movie Robe, I think. And
The road.
one of the things that's harder for younger generations to do as well is to uh, understand how important religion and Christianity was in the motivation and behaviors and community life of people in the past, not just in the 50s, but 19th century and 18th century as well.
Absolutely. At Christianity, church going, faith were all aspects of living at the time that had a very different place in the social and cultural life of the nation than it does now. And so a movie like The Robe, which was a Christian epic about Christ and early Christians, could be released by a major studio in the expectation that it would have a huge audience base and reception. It happened. Release that film today, and it would play to just a minority audience that would never have had the financial impact that the audience that at the time wanted to see a film like that did have, and saved the industry. So Christianity, church going to mosques, going to temples, synagogue, all had a different place in the culture then than it does now. But also, I think there's so much thinking of the current moment in terms of victim and victimizer. And that sort of very simple binary has infected the thinking of a lot of our students, and I feel that they are making misjudgments based upon that overly simplistic division between those in power and those who are who are victims of that power. Victim and victimizer, colonizer and colonized.
Yeah,
When you
I
impose
completely
that
agree with that
rigid
point. Yeah.
grid onto the films of the 50s, when you impose that grid onto the films of the 50s, you're in danger of misreading the entire period. And I think that can happen. If a radical left a teacher who indoctrinates students into the thinking that I'm talking about wrote about the movies that I write about in the 50s, the conclusions and evaluations would be very different and skewed from a contemporary perspective. Whereas I try to anchor the films in their own time period, but also I call them out when they are guilty of racism or omission or insensitivity to women or to sex or to homosexuality or to any group. I call them out when I ran into blind spots or insensitivity, but I don't evaluate the worth of the entire period according to how they fill in the boxes according to that contemporary political criteria. Is that clear what I'm saying?
Yes, it's clear. Yeah. And I think it's well said, and I agree with the approach.
Now, but I don't want how it looks now to overwhelm how it was then, because I know firsthand how it was then.
Yes. Uh, just looking at the time, I think I better get to my last couple of questions. So
Okay.
the penultimate one I want to ask is why were the 1950s the most creative period in American film history, in your view?
Well, you have to add that, in my opinion. In my opinion, I don't know how many historians would accept that, but in my opinion, it was the most creative 10 years, I think in part because it was sink or swim. The studios knew they had to come up with different subject matter, and there are many good films, by the way, about the matter of race in the 50s. It's not as though 50s films ignored racial topics. They certainly did not. The first black movie star was developed in the 50s, the great Sidney Poitier. He got his start in the 50s. There was room for one black star, unfortunately, and it was a great actor named Sidney Poitier. So it wasn't only in terms of technologies, 3D, Cinerama, CinemaScope, VistaVision, Technorama, Todd AO. It was also in terms of subject matter, the kinds of elaborate subject matter in terms of biblical epics, expensive musicals, extravagant musical extravaganzas that the 50s came up with as a method of saving the industry. They couldn't simply offer the kinds of movies that they had always done. They had to find something new. They had to find new stars, the method actors, James Dean, Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift. I mean, great new acting styles in the 50s, the method. And that created a different level of subject matter. So it wasn't only the big, expensive projects that took hold in the 50s, it was also the intimate dramas, the psychodramas and the melodramas that had a different level of engagement and of depth than it had ever had before. It was sink or swim. And so they had to come up with a whole raft of new subject matter, new modes of presentation, new actors. It couldn't be as it always was. So it had to be creative. And it was. And I think that creativity continued into the 60s, which was also a very rich period and a very confused period, because the 60s looks backward and forward. It's very two-faced, Janus-faced, back and forth. And ultimately, the 60s brought the golden age of Hollywood to an end. And then when we get to the 70s, that period is called significantly the new Hollywood. So I'm dealing in the 50s and 60s with the end of the classic era. And a very creative end, I think it is, in both decades.
Yeah. The last thing I'd like to ask you, Foster, is just to could you say a word or two about the I guess we could call it a journey of writing this book. You say that it's a book that took you 70 years to write.
Well,
And it's
that was
really a
for
remarkable
dramatic effect.
achievement.
That was for,
Yes, yeah.
don't take it literally, it was for dramatic effect. I think I said earlier that I knew when I was a kid going to the movies that this was what I wanted to do, because I remember after seeing a movie, I would go to our room downstairs and write up notes about the film. And then when I got my first typewriter, I would type up mini reviews of the films. So in effect, I say to myself now, looking back, you were already starting to gather notes for this book when you were a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, in that room downstairs. So seeing the movies in the 50s, thinking about them and teaching them over the years, and then writing about them once I got the contract from Alfred Knopf, and it took a long time. It's a long book, as you know. I say
Yeah.
overall, it was a 70-year period. My book on the 60s is not going to take me 70 years because I don't have the 70 years. I'd be 151 at that point, so we're not going to talk about that. It'll be much shorter, but I have my template and I have my notes already in place. But yes, it was a labor of love that took a long time, and I've written a number of books, but as far as I'm concerned, this is my book. The other books I'm proud of, but this is the one that's most important to me. I hope in years to come, people will consider it a standard version of the 50s, that it will become a kind of standard text or reference book for the 50s. With all of its opinions, it's a very subjective presentation. I do not at all write like a disembodied historian. I'm very subjective and personal, as you know, but I wouldn't take out those personal touches. I think that helps to make the book. So I've gotten notes from readers who thanked me for the personal touch because it said it started them thinking about their own history of moviegoing. And if we're moviegoers, we all have a history like the one I've shared in this volume. You have your history of moviegoing.
My favorite personal touch from the book was you describing a movie that I referenced earlier as loving from the 50s, Some Like It Hot. Watching that in the theater and being there when people erupted in laughter at the scene where he reveals that he's a man. I loved hearing about that because I love
that
the
was an
movie.
amazing experience. I saw Some Like It Hot on a Saturday night at the most famous movie palace in the world, Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, which I'm happy to say is still there. and still showing movies on a huge IMAX screen. Every time I'm in Los Angeles, my hometown, and I'm going to be there next week, I make an absolute point of seeing a movie at Grauman's, even if the movie, and most of the time it is some awful contemporary blockbuster. But I always see it at Grauman's. When I saw Some Like It Hot at Grauman's Chinese on that Saturday night, and he says, I have to, that wonderful dialogue at the end, I'm a man. And Joey Brown turns to him and says, nobody's perfect. The audience roared in a way that I will never forget. There was such a roar of amusement and surprise and appreciation. I will carry it with me forever. And that was in an audience in a great theater, first run. I wonder if that experience can be duplicated today.
Well, I hope so, but if it can't, at least we have your book to remind us of that those great moments are possible. I really enjoyed learning more about this period of time, and I have a huge list of movies I still need to get to. I also really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to you today. So thank you so much
I
for your time.
appreciate you reaching out to me. I really do. I appreciate hearing from you. And it's an honor for me to be speaking to you across the world through the miracle of modern technology.